Okay, welcome back. I got cut off a little bit early there. That was actually my fault, but that allowed actually some questions from Anne and Lyndon, and so I want to address one of them. Anne brought up the question, the kind of classic "my kid could do that" question about kind of like these random process sort of actions, such as like the most stereotypically the Jean Arp dropping paper on like ripped up paper on a piece of paper. And I think, I mean, it's a reasonable point up to a point, but it's unreasonable in another sense. It's unreasonable in part because Jean Art made these things with no expectation of them going to be art or not. They were just a process he was followed, and they're also, when you think about it, oftentimes when people say that in a museum, "Ah, my kid could do that." Well, in this particular case, how many kids, how many 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds do you know who have the discipline to do the same process for a whole day, for like a 10-hour day, or to do the same kind of process for a 2-week period where they're every day ripping up pieces of paper, dropping them, seeing how they arrange, marking those spots, gluing them down. Just the discipline is something that indicates this is a work by a trained and mature artist, because only a trained and mature artist would be crazy enough to want to keep doing it, figuring that there would be some end result, something learned from that process. Um, so we left off because I was trying to talk about how this interest in randomness and the surrealist was not only a thing that led to these kind of non-objective looking works like the paper drop pieces, but also to works like these. These are by Max Ernst, and these are later works for him, and they're these kind of like fantasy landscapes spaces with bits and pieces of objects and people and stuff in them, but they are made entirely randomly. The way he starts making them is he covers the whole painting with layers and layers of wet paint, all very transparent paint, and then he presses into them. He rolls fruit and objects and just whatever stuff. Well, this is back in the 30s and 40s, so not now. But he put all this stuff into them, just making all these random textures, just trying to create just randomness. And then he lets that dry and he sits back and looks at it. And he asks himself, it's kind of like the classic Da Vinci question of looking at a wall of paint peeling and asking yourself, what do I see in it? Right? That was Leonardo da Vinci said that was one of the most important trainings that any person should do in terms of becoming a painter, is to learn how to look at random textures and see stuff within it. And that's what Max Ernst is doing here. He's creating his own random textures and then looking and asking himself the question, what do I see? What's there? And then painting it in a way to reveal the stuff he sees within it. It's pretty cool. So the Surrealists were heavily influential on the American painters who later became known as the Abstract Expressionists. And so we have a hard time sometimes seeing it because these paintings don't look surreal. They don't have any surreal imagery, but they are. Pollock was definitely influenced by the Surrealist interest in randomness, and in automatic processes. And once again, getting back to the "my kid could do that" kind of argument, I don't think the fact, like some people will argue that Pollock is great because there is nothing random here. There was a lot of control, but there was a ton of randomness in here. It was purposefully random. It was random so that Pollock could find things that he wouldn't necessarily find otherwise, because by controlling things, you limit yourself. By allowing things to be uncontrolled, you open up the potential of what you can do. That's what the Surrealists believed, and that's what definitely Pollock believed. And so Lavender Mist, I think, is one of the great paintings of the 20th century, but it but you have to accept that it started with a very kind of random process. That doesn't mean it's a random image. The image is very controlled in terms of its finish, in terms of like how how it's darker at the top, how the lavender feels most distant, kind of in the middle of the center third, right across the middle. And these things create kind of a sense of being in a landscape and looking through things. All of that was probably at least unconsciously thought about, probably consciously thought about in the final stages of making the work. But there's a ton of randomness in every single mark. Those two things don't discredit each other. Um, there was also, besides the Americans, there was another group of artists, a Canadian group of artists, who were also highly influenced by the Surrealists. They were called the Automatistes, and here's a good example of one of theirs. Um, and now we're heading into the mid 20th century and some various artists who were kind of interested in these kind of process ideas. Jean Tinguely came out of the Surrealist movement, but he started to make these kind of random action and random producing, random doing type machines. And just a different kind of interest in process and a different kind of way of exploring randomness in process. And in the 60s, we start to see kind of a couple of trends, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more at a later part of this lecture, but just to keep in mind that in the 60s, as the popularity of the abstract expressionists diminishes, we have a growing interest in these artists called the minimalists, painters and minimalist artists, minimalist sculptures. And not all of the minimalists were very process focused, but Frank Stella definitely was, especially at the beginning, very much designing his paintings as a set of processes that he was following, like especially these dark ones, and then seeing how those processes would play out in the act of making the thing. And this is also, and you'll see how this connects later, is also connected to something that came later, which was called the anti-form movement. So Kenneth Nolan also shows some interest in that kind of idea of making art that's about reflecting a process, a way of thinking. Like if I start with a circle and then build from there, what is the end result? If I start with horizontal lines and I build from there, what is the end result? Robert Morris also was, and we're now getting into kind of a group of artists that we tend to call the post-minimalist artists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Robert Morris, you can also see the interest in processes both in the idea of I'm just going to do some actions and see what they create, right? Like what if I take this felt and I cut it all in this kind of direction and then hang it like this? What is the end result? And then the objects then also become, in a way, a representation of process because they are a reflection of the action of gravity on them. And also, post-minimalists, I would also include Morris Louis and Eva Hesse. And like when we see a Morris Louis painting in a museum, that's the painting down here. If we see a Morris Louis painting in a museum, like if you go to the Baltimore Museum of Art, where Morris Louis was from Baltimore, and they have some of the best collection of Morris Louis paintings. They look very product focused because they're very clean and they're very, they're just very kind of designy, and the colors are bright and pretty, and they just seem like these very kind of product focused kind of objects. But they very much are a reflection of process, where he was asking himself the questions of like, if I pour the paint and if I fold my canvas and let it hang loose when I pour the paint in these certain angles, what is the end result, right? Rather than controlling it exactly, letting it follow a process that is, or let the product be a direct reflection of the set of rules that you began with. I'm going to pour all from the corner, and I'm going to pour to the center. I'm going to fold the canvas this way, and I'm going to see what happens. So you may be asking yourself, but wait, why is all of this important to me? What is all this focus on process? How does it relate to me? And how do all these artists that we're talking about relate to you? And so I want to take a little bit of break from this kind of art historical talking about process to get into the nitty gritty of like how do we develop our artwork and how do we develop our ideas, because process is not just about physical process. Process is also about idea development process. They're all kind of interrelated. So here are some major points. I'm going to actually read the major points here. So number one, every work of art has a process. No matter how product focused you are, no matter how much you want it to just be about this shining idea of a work of art that you can clearly envision at the end, there still has to be a process to make the thing. There is no way to make a work of art without process. And that many artists make their artwork, find a way to improve their artwork by focusing on the process, by thinking about, well, how am